Section 20 of L'Assommoir. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. L'Assommoir by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest A. Visitelli. Second part of Chapter 5. She bluntly accused Gervaise of flirting with Goujet. She lied. She pretended she had surprised them together one night on a seat on the exterior boulevards. The thought of this liaison, of pleasures that her sister-in-law was no doubt enjoying, exasperated her still more because of her own ugly woman's strict sense of propriety. Every day the same cry came from her heart to her lips. What does she have, that wretched cripple, for people to fall in love with her? Why doesn't anyone want me? She busied herself in endless gossiping among the neighbors. She told them the whole story. The day the Coupeaus got married, she turned her nose up at her. Oh, she had a keen nose. She could smell in advance how it would turn out. Then Clump Clump pretended to be so sweet. What a hypocrite! She and her husband had only agreed to be Nana's godparents for the sake of her brother. What a bundle it had cost, that fancy christening! If Clump Clump were on her deathbed, she wouldn't give her a glass of water, no matter how much she begged. She didn't want anything to do with such a shameless baggage. Little Nana would always be welcome when she came up to see her godparents. The child couldn't be blamed for her mother's sins. But there was no use trying to tell Coupeau anything. Any real man in his situation would have beaten his wife and put a stop to it all. All they wanted was for him to insist on respect for his family. Mon Dieu, if she, Madame Lorilleux, had acted like that, Coupeau wouldn't be so complacent. He would have stabbed her for sure with his shears. The Boches, however, who sternly disapproved of quarrels in their building, said that the Lorilleuxs were in the wrong. The Lorilleuxs were no doubt respectable persons, quiet, working the whole day long, and paying their rent regularly. But really, jealousy had driven them mad. And they were mean enough to skin an egg, real misers. They were so stingy they'd hide their bottle when anyone came in, so as not to have to offer a glass of wine. Not regular people at all. Gervaise had brought over cassis and soda water one day to drink with the Boches. When Madame Lorilleux went by, she acted out spitting before the concierge's door. Well, after that, when Madame Boche swept the corridors on Saturdays, she always left a pile of trash before the Lorilleux's door. "It isn't to be wondered at," Madame Lorilleux would exclaim. "Clump Clump's always stuffing them, the gluttons. Ah, they're all alike. But they had better not annoy me. I'll complain to the landlord. Only yesterday I saw that sly old Boche chasing after Madame Gaudron's skirts. Just fancy, a woman of that age, and who has half a dozen children too. It's positively disgusting. If I catch them at anything of the sort again, I'll tell Madame Boche, and she'll give them both the hiding. That'll be something to laugh at." Mother Coupeau continued to visit the two houses, agreeing with everybody, and even managing to get asked oftener to dinner by complacently listening one night to her daughter and the next night to her daughter-in-law. However, Madame Lerat did not go to visit the Coupeaus because she had argued with Gervaise about a zouave who had cut the nose of his mistress with a razor. She was on the side of the zouave, saying it was evidence of a great passion, but without explaining further her thought. Then she had made Madame Lorilleux even more angry by telling her that Clump Clump had called her cow tail in front of 15 or 20 people. Yes, that's what the Boches and all the neighbors called her now, cow tail. Gervaise remained calm and cheerful among all these goings-on. She often stood by the door of her shop greeting friends who passed by with a nod and a smile. It was her pleasure to take a moment between batches of ironing to enjoy the street and take pride in her own stretch of sidewalk. She felt that the Rue de la Goutte d'Or was hers, and the neighboring streets and the whole neighborhood. As she stood there with her blonde hair slightly damp from the heat of the shop, she would look left and right, taking in the people, the buildings, and the sky. To the left, Rue de la Goutte d'Or was peaceful and almost empty, like a country town, with women idling in their doorways. While to the right, only a short distance away, Rue des Poissonniers had a noisy throng of people and vehicles. The stretch of gutter before her own shop became very important in her mind. It was like a wide river which she longed to see neat and clean. It was a lively river, coloured by the dye shop with the most fanciful of hues, which contrasted with the black mud beside it. Then there were the shops, a large grocery with a display of dried fruits protected by mesh nets, a shop selling work clothes which had white tunics and blue smocks hanging before it with arms that waved at the slightest breeze. Cats were purring on the counters of the fruit store and the tripe shop. Madame Vigouroux, the coal dealer next door, returned her greetings. She was a plump, short woman with bright eyes in a dark face, who was always joking with the men while standing at her doorway. Her shop was decorated in imitation of a rustic chalet. The neighbors on the other side were a mother and daughter, the Cudorges. The umbrella sellers kept their door closed and never came out to visit. Gervaise always looked across the road too, through the wide carriage entrance of the windowless wall opposite her at the blacksmith's forge. The courtyard was cluttered with vans and carts. Inscribed on the wall was the word blacksmith. At the lower end of the wall, between the small shops selling scrap iron and fried potatoes, was a watchmaker. He wore a frock coat and was always very neat. His cuckoo clocks could be heard in chorus against the background noise of the street and the blacksmith's rhythmic clanging. The neighborhood in general thought Gervaise very nice. There was, it is true, a great deal of scandal related regarding her, but everyone admired her large eyes, small mouth, and beautiful white teeth. In short, she was a pretty blonde, and had it not been for her crippled leg, she might have ranked among the comeliest. She was now in her 28th year, and had grown considerably plumper. Her fine features were becoming puffy, and her gestures were assuming a pleasant indolence. At times, she occasionally seemed to forget herself on the edge of a chair while she waited for her iron to heat, smiling vaguely and with an expression of greedy joy upon her face. She was becoming fond of good living, everybody said so. But that was not a very grave fault, but rather the contrary. When one earns sufficient to be able to buy good food, one would be foolish to eat potato parings. All the more so as she continued to work very hard, slaving to please her customers, sitting up late at night after the place was closed, whenever there was anything urgent. She was lucky, as all her neighbors said. Everything prospered with her. She did the washing for all the house, Monsieur Madinier, Mademoiselle Remonjou, the Boches. She even secured some of the customers of her old employer, Madame Fauconnier, Parisian ladies living in the Rue du Faubourg Poissonnière. As early as the third week, she was obliged to engage 2 workwomen, Madame Putois and tall Clémence, the girl who used to live on the 6th floor. Counting her apprentice, that little squint-eyed Augustine, who was as ugly as a beggar's behind, that made 3 persons in her employ. Others would certainly have lost their heads at such a piece of good fortune. It was excusable for her to slack a little on a Monday, after drudging all through the week. Besides, it was necessary to her. She would have no courage left, and would have expected to see the shirts iron themselves, if she had not been able to dress up in some pretty thing. Gervaise was always so amiable, meek as a lamb, sweet as sugar. There wasn't anyone she disliked except Madame Lorilleux. While she was enjoying a good meal and coffee, she could be indulgent and forgive everybody, saying, "We have to forgive each other, don't we? Unless we want to live like savages." Hadn't all her dreams come true? She remembered her old dream, to have a job, enough bread to eat and a corner in which to sleep, to bring up her children, not to be beaten, and to die in her own bed. She had everything she wanted now, and more than she had ever expected. She laughed, thinking of delaying dying in her own bed as long as possible. It was to Coupeau especially that Gervaise behaved nicely. Never an angry word, never a complaint behind her husband's back. The zinc worker had at length resumed work, and as the job he was engaged on was at the other side of Paris, she gave him every morning 40 sous for his luncheon, his glass of wine, and his tobacco. Only 2 days out of every 6, Coupeau would stop on the way, spend the 40 sous in drink with a friend, and return home to lunch with some cock and bull story. Once even he did not take the trouble to go far. He treated himself, My Boots, and 3 others to a regular feast, snails, roast meat, and some sealed bottles of wine, at the Capuchin on the Barrière la Chapelle. Then, as his 40 sous were not sufficient, he had sent the waiter to his wife with the bill and the information that he was in pawn. She laughed and shrugged her shoulders. Where was the harm if her old man amused himself a bit? You must give men a long rein if you want to live peaceably at home. From one word to another, one soon arrived at blows. Mon Dieu, it was easy to understand. Coupeau still suffered from his leg. Besides, he was led astray. He was obliged to do as the others did, or else he would be thought a cheapskate. And it was really a matter of no consequence. If he came home a bit elevated, he went to bed, and 2 hours afterwards he was all right again. It was now the warm time of the year. One June afternoon, a Saturday, when there was a lot of work to get through, Gervaise herself had piled the coke into the stove, around which 10 irons were heating, whilst a rumbling sound issued from the chimney. At that hour the sun was shining full on the shop front, and the pavement reflected the heat waves, causing all sorts of quaint shadows to dance over the ceiling, and that blaze of light, which assumed a bluish tinge from the color of the paper on the shelves and against the window, was almost blinding in the intensity with which it shone over the ironing table, like a golden dust shaken among the fine linen. The atmosphere was stifling. The shop door was thrown wide open, but not a breath of air entered. The clothes which were hung up on brass wires to dry steamed and became as stiff as shavings in less than 3/4 of an hour. For some little while past, an oppressive silence had reigned in that furnace-like heat, interrupted only by the smothered sound of the banging down of the irons on the thick blanket covered with calico. "Ah, well," said Gervaise, "it's enough to melt one. We might have to take off our chemises." She was sitting on the floor in front of a basin, starching some things. Her sleeves were rolled up and her camisole was slipping down her shoulders. Little curls of golden hair were stuck to her skin by perspiration. She carefully dipped caps, shirt fronts, entire petticoats, and the trimmings of women's drawers into the milky water. Then she rolled the things up and placed them at the bottom of a square basket, after dipping her hand in a pail and shaking it over the portions of the shirts and drawers which she had not starched. "This basketful's for you, Madame Putois," she said. "Look sharp now, it dries at once, and will want doing all over again in an hour." Madame Putois, a thin little woman of 45, was ironing. Though she was buttoned up in an old chestnut-colored dress, there was not a drop of perspiration to be seen. She had not even taken her cap off, a black cap trimmed with green ribbons turned partly yellow. And she stood perfectly upright in front of the ironing table, which was too high for her, sticking out her elbows and moving her iron with the jerky evolutions of a puppet. On a sudden she exclaimed, "Ah no, Mademoiselle Clemence, you mustn't take your camisole off. You know I don't like such indecencies. While you're about it, you'd better show everything. There's already 3 men over the way stopping to look." Tall Clemence called her an old beast between her teeth. She was suffocating. She might certainly make herself comfortable. Everyone was not gifted with a skin as dry as touchwood. Besides, no one could see anything. And she held up her arms whilst her opulent bosom almost ripped her chemise, and her shoulders were bursting through the straps. At the rate she was going, Clemence was not likely to have any marrow left in her bones long before she was 30 years old. Mornings after big parties, she was unable to feel the ground she trod upon, and fell asleep over her work, whilst her head and her stomach seemed as though stuffed full of rags. but she was kept on all the same, for no other workwoman could iron a shirt with her style. Shirts were her specialty. "This is mine, isn't it?" she declared, tapping her bosom. "And it doesn't bite, it hurts nobody." "Clemence, put your wrapper on again," said Gervaise. "Madame Putois is right, it isn't decent. People will begin to take my house for what it isn't." So tall Clemence dressed herself again, grumbling the while. Mon Dieu, there's prudery for you. And she vented her rage on the apprentice, that squint-eyed Augustine, who was ironing some stockings and handkerchiefs beside her. She jostled her and pushed her with her elbow. But Augustine, who was of a surly disposition, and slyly spiteful in the way of an animal and a drudge, spat on the back of the other's dress, just out of revenge, without being seen. Gervaise, during this incident, had commenced a cap belonging to Madame Boche, which she intended to take great pains with. She had prepared some boiled starch to make it look new again. She was gently passing a little iron, rounded at both ends, over the inside of the crown of the cap, when a bony-looking woman entered the shop, her face covered with red blotches and her skirts sopping wet. It was a washerwoman who employed 3 assistants at the wash-house in the Rue de la Goutte d'Or. End of second part of chapter 5. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.